Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. The UCP Leadership Race is in full tilt, and it seems like some of the positions that are getting put out there are a little bit, let's go with unorthodox to start with. Some of the most unorthodox positions that we've seen have been coming from, by and large, one of the front runners, Danielle Smith. And a key point of her campaign has had to do with the Free Alberta strategy and something called the Alberta Sovereignty Act. A lot of controversy around this, and hopefully in order to try to get a little bit of a better understanding as to what's going on with it, what the problems with it are, and what the feasibility is, we are very excited to be joined today by Martin Olszynski. He is a University of Calgary associate law professor, a practicing lawyer, and some other things he's going to tell you about in just a sec. Martin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Cheers. Thanks very much for having me.
So before we get into this thing, can you tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I've been at the University of Calgary, I guess, for almost 10 years. I think I joined in 2013. Before that, I was a lawyer in Ottawa, actually working for the federal government for about 6 years at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So I've sort of always been doing, kind of cut my teeth doing environmental natural resources law for the federal government as a lawyer, and then as an academic, that's been my sort of main wheelhouse. But one of the things actually when you teach or research and write about environmental law, it's very heavily administrative, right? So like so much of it is about, there's definitely suing polluters and all that kind of stuff. But if you actually think about environmental law, for instance, a lot of it is actually about holding governments to account. And so I've always been very interested in and had to know something about, judicial supervision of government action, right? And like the way that the courts enforce our laws, they enforce our constitution. So I've always sort of been interested in that. And then in the last few years, actually about 4 or 5 years ago, was actually asked to start teaching. One of our core courses is called administrative law. It's something that all students have to learn. And some of the things that we're going to talk about here right away sort of fall into that wheelhouse. And so I've been sort of tracking a lot of these developments. In fact, the Free Alberta strategy and the Alberta Sovereignty Act, they're sort of popular or in the news anyways right now, but they were announced like a year ago. And in fact, a year ago in my administrative law class, I was sort of pulling my hair out in front of my students already.
Okay. And I think it's important to highlight we're going to get, as you said, we're going to get into it with the Free Alberta strategy and the Alberta Sovereignty Act. A big part of what's driving, I think, the interest from people who maybe aren't versed particularly well in constitutional law or environmental law is the fact that there is this feeling. How rooted in reality it is probably up for some debate, but there's a feeling that Ottawa tells us what resources we can develop and how we can develop them and all of that. So I think it's important to highlight right out of the gates, there's a really big environmental piece to what Danielle Smith is pursuing with this, because she's been talking about the port of Churchill and digging big holes in mud, because that works well. But let's to start with, what's your understanding of the Free Alberta strategy? Because the Alberta Sovereignty Act is kind of a piece of that.
That's right. Yeah. Well, they call it the kind of the cornerstone or sort of like a really integral part of it, right? So, I mean, essentially this is, thinly disguised separatism, right? Like, and I think that's an important point to make because we're going to talk eventually about things like democracy and the rule of law and essentially it comes back to this question of like, and when you think about the way that pundits in particular, like the mainstream media tends to talk about this, it is just anti-Ottawa sentiment, right? It's just standing up to Ottawa. And of course, that is part of what animates it for sure, right? So the Free Alberta strategy is essentially this idea that we can become sort of a nation within a nation. There's often this sort of like borrowing of the Quebec example. And so there's a bunch of stuff in there that's sort of, our own pension plan, our own police force. And so whatever, like to some extent, sure, like it has its roots and we could talk about the firewall letter, right? And all that kind of stuff from back in the day. But then there's these other parts here. And the Sovereignty Act is kind of like a really big part of this, right? It sort of recognizes that, well, you can't actually have separatism by another name. Separatism is one thing. And so what they're trying to propose here can't actually achieve that unless they jam the system. And the system I'm referring to then is really essentially like the rule of law, our courts, and our system of democratic governance, the separation of powers, right? So for instance, and without getting into the nitty gritty of it, not to get too technical, but like there's no actually space in our constitution when we think about, there's a list there we call Section 91 and Section 92. These are these sections that say the federal government gets to pass laws in relation to the things that are mentioned here in Section 91, and the provincial government gets to pass things that are less listed in Section 92. There's no part of Section 92 that says that the provincial government can pass laws that essentially disallow federal laws from applying, right? It's just not there. There's actually nothing also in the Constitution that says that the provincial government can give itself that authority essentially to declare what laws are constitutional or not. That's what our courts do. And so then we have this whole separation of powers, right? This idea that there's an executive, there's a legislature, and there's a judicial branch, and we need them to be separate so that they keep each other in check. And so the big thing with the Alberta Sovereignty Act that I have a hard time, I think, articulating sometimes and getting across to people is that, this is like we have this separation of powers that's existed for hundreds of years as kind of like a core building block of democracy, right? It's like when you think back to the founding fathers in the US, they spent all this time thinking about tyranny and thinking about how things have gone wrong. And they wanted to build a system of government that would withstand that. And they said, here is the basic model. We need to have these three branches and they need to be separate. The Alberta Sovereignty Act just completely tosses that aside. It's like, no big deal. Our legislature can decide these things. We're going to decide. And if the courts don't like it, too bad. We don't care, basically. We're going to ignore the courts, right? And so that's, it's easy, sometimes, I have sometimes people saying, oh, well, you don't need to panic. It's going to be okay. And it's like, well, I'm not panicking, but I think it's impossible to overstate what a massive departure this is from basic norms of democratic governance, and especially this idea. And so when I've seen Ms. Smith get on radio and on Twitter, whatever it is.
You still get to see her Twitter?
Yes, I do actually. Yeah. I've told, this is sort of funny, but, it's like, I refer to her as a tyrant, and I know that that's like an edgy term, and, or maybe it is for maybe some people just don't even understand what I'm trying to get across, but, anyways, it hasn't been enough, or it doesn't bother her, maybe she's not too worried about it anyways, that's fine. But yeah, like the reality is that, she's basically said, I am prepared to ignore the courts. I think at one point she sort of threatened the courts. She said that if they were to strike down this law, that would create a crisis, right? And it's like, that's not her place ever. It's not a politician's job. It's not a premier's job to sort of to try to push around the courts to get the outcome that she wants. And so there's this like deeply undemocratic vibe that comes across in the Free Alberta strategy and the people who are pushing it. And again, I think they sometimes, there's this idea for the people who are sort of on the sidelines to sort of say, well, but this is just Ottawa. I think Don Braid always just refers to it as sort of the anti-Ottawa thing. It's not an anti-Ottawa thing. It's an anti-law thing. It's it's an anti-democratic governance thing. And if you peel back, a little bit more too, even just going back to the Free Alberta strategy, like the whole thing is a trick, right? Like if you wanted separatism, go for separatism, but they're not, because they know that, I think they know that most Albertans aren't there. They don't have a majority of Albertans who are prepared to go there. And so right off the bat, that's your first clue, I think, that that this is more than just anti-Ottawa sentiment. This is somebody who is prepared to go to certain lengths and to take certain steps to thwart or get around democracy because they think because it interferes with their goals, right? And so it's a, and yeah, it's hugely problematic.
One of the things that I found very interesting about the Alberta Sovereignty Act, as it's described in the Free Alberta Strategy, I mean, first of all, there's been no text of this act that I've been able to find anywhere. So it's just sort of this trust us, which always ends well historically. But the other piece of it is that it's another piece of legislation that treats Albertans as if the province is a monolith. I mean, there's a phrase in the Free Alberta Strategy where it says this would provide Alberta's legislature with the authority to refuse enforcement of any specific act of Parliament or federal court ruling that Alberta's electorate body deemed to be a federal intrusion into an area of provincial jurisdiction, and this is the part that really grabs me, or unfairly prejudicial to the interests of Albertans. I mean, you could probably come up with some more subjective wording, but my immediate reaction to hearing that is okay, so which interests, which Albertans, and this is all being defined by the Premier's office? Am I reading too much into that, or?
No, I mean, look, I mean, to some extent, and we've been, I don't know how long you've been here. Like I said, I've been here about 10 years. I mean, part of that's kind of par for the course, especially I find with some politicians and some political sort of like groups to speak in that way, of that, to assume that monolithic voice, to assume that sort of uniformity. Jason Kenney did it for sure. I think there's obviously, I mean, when we look at the record of the current government and voting, I mean, obviously, yeah, the idea that this is somehow like a democratic thing and that any MLA would be expected to vote with their conscience or whatever, whatever the idea is there, that they would all vote, but she I think even mentioned very quickly that she was quite confident that she would get the votes that she needed on some of those issues, right? But for sure, that idea of that there is this just like monolithic, uniform Albertan, right? And I think we have there's some awesome work being done by Jared Wesley, I think, at U of A, has done some work on that, right? The idea of what do Albertans, how do they conceive of themselves? But what I wanted to sort of tie into here a bit is think about the anti-Alberta inquiry, right? The what was it called? It was the Public Inquiry into Anti-Alberta Energy Campaigns. And of course, what it was is a group of organizations, both inside and outside of Alberta, who were concerned about climate change, right? And we're concerned about the scale and pace of development in the province of oil sands, which everyone actually knew, like even the government would, if you look at the news stories along the way, like everyone knew things were running red hot. And it was a huge problem. Fort Mac had huge issues of capacity, and infrastructure and services. But, instead of saying like, oh, here's a group of people who have concerns about climate change, no, they were anti-Albertan, right? So to some extent, and again, today catching, so Jason Kenney today said, the Premier said that, he thought the Alberta Sovereignty Act was nuts. And he said that he didn't think it would, he didn't think even the Lieutenant Governor would maybe even pass it into law, do that sort of symbolic work that she does. And I was sort of like scratching my head, and I was like, oh crap, like I agree with the Premier, which is probably something like I don't think it's ever happened. But of course, like he owns this, right? This is like a political culture. The Alberta Sovereignty Act and the Free Alberta Strategy are the logical conclusion or the sort of next step in a kind of politics that's been picking up steam in this province for 4 or 5 years, right? And it has those things, exactly the idea that there is a monolithic Albertan interest, that it's always in antagonism to Ottawa, that it doesn't accept certain things that the rest of Canada consider important, things like climate change. And so this really strong othering and really sort of them versus us, right? It's always that battle, them versus us.
I can't help but think, like, even for the most ardent conservative UCP supporters, I should say, because I think there is a difference for a lot of people in between what a conservative is and what the UCP has become. That's a whole different conversation. But for a lot of people, I think it's pretty easy to look at the track record of the current government that believed that it had the best interests of Albertans. That's what they were acting on. And you can see these like series of, it would be comical if they weren't so consequential missteps where they've gone and done a very big thing very, very badly. And I think that kind of, that's what alarms, part of what alarms me the most about this whole thing, because, you know, if you're going to say we're going to pick and choose as a legislative body what greater laws we're going to follow or not. I mean, first of all, the immediate sort of question that I have is like, cool, so can like Calgary do that too? Can Airdrie say, hey, you know what, Alberta, we've decided to institute our Airdrie Sovereignty Act, and you know, whatever, we're going to serve only pickles on Tuesdays or something. I don't know. But the idea that you're going to be so right that you're going to defy not only the laws, but the systems that put those laws in place and ensure that they do the things they're supposed to do. That seems like, you know, if maybe they had a better track record of getting stuff right, it would be slightly less alarming. But the track record is so abysmally like, oh, we got that wrong too. I'm at a loss for how they're able to sell this.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's a good point. I mean, part of it is that, of course, you know, this is where you know, Ms. Smith has been, I think, very deliberate in sort of like casting herself as the anti-establishment candidate. So all of the things that you described get hung on the establishment, and she says, "I'm not that." You know, and but absolutely, it's, you know, even if you say something like, you know, which tends to be a conservative actually principle, right? The idea that, you know, government's actually not very good at things, so we should be more humble and let the free market do more, for instance, and we should, you know, and so smaller government. To think then that same kind of group would then sort of jump headfirst into a sort of unprecedented experiment where exactly as you say, I mean, once the courts don't matter, once you say that you're prepared to ignore the courts in some instances, then of course you're prepared to ignore them in all instances. And just as importantly, though, you've lost the authority to insist that others respect those institutions, right? And so, you know, Calgary, Edmonton can do it, you know. What about British Columbia, more specifically? Perhaps British Columbia doesn't actually, you know, well, we know that they actually aren't super stoked, for instance, on having a federal pipeline cut through, you know, and make it their way down to their coast. So, you know, like all bets are off, you know, and it sounds really, again, it's like, it's so hard to convey this point that like, these are our institutions, these are our like institutional arrangements, and as much as they can be robust, they are also fragile. And once you take them apart, it can be very difficult to put them back together, right? Like, you know, we all, you know, and as a law prof, for instance, right? Like, I mean, I think I can overstate probably sometimes in my own mind, you know, the tangibility of law and the rule of law. And yet so much of it depends on, you know, essentially like the handshake, right? Like our courts don't have their own enforcement. Courts don't have their own police force. We have a police force, and the police carry out court orders when they have to, right? And legislatures, for instance, I mean, you know, like they respect the courts, not because the courts will come over there and knock them over the head, but because that's the institutional arrangement that we've accepted for 200 years is fundamental to preserving democracy and the rule of law. And so when so this is what I said would happen. So when any politician says like whatever, that's disqualifying, right? And I know people don't like to, you know, and Ms. Smith will go on about cancel culture, something like that, about that in that moment. But it's actually really, it's just stating a very plain fact that, you know, democracy isn't inevitable. It's actually quite difficult. And one of the things I think you and I have gone back and forth a bit on Twitter about this, and I got my hands on Tim Snyder's book on tyranny, right? And one of the things right off the bat, which I thought was super useful for me in this space, because I've talked about how awkward it is sometimes to talk about these things and raising the alarm that it feels like our political discourse isn't capable of really having this discussion, because when we think about tyranny and fascism and all those things, of course, we think about them after the fact, right? We saw after they went and did those things, but of course, before they did those things, they weren't those things, right? They had to get there. They first had, and so one of the things that was, again, like when you look at history, is that these things do happen. And if we're not vigilant about them, if we don't insist on certain things, like no, you don't go around essentially like declaring yourself to be above the law and above the courts, that's just disqualifying. Doesn't matter what you're selling, doesn't matter what your brand is and how angry everybody else is going to be, that's just not on. And we kind of need to get back to that place, and these kind of discussions I think are part of that. So like, if you want to separate, that's your jam, fill your boots. Like I'll support your right to advocate for that. I might not agree, that's fine. But when you start to talk about subverting the rule of law, ignoring the courts, pushing a kind of like essentially like a nihilistic sort of view of everything, nothing matters, the courts, every law is just politics to the, and taking that to an extreme degree, then we really start getting into trouble. And it's, again, it's hard to understand how bad that trouble can be, but we know from history that it can be very bad.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of the historical piece, I've been trying to find a record of a leader historically who has said, I'm going to pick and choose what laws I'm going to follow. I'm also going to have my own police force, and things have worked out well. I mean, his history does not have any examples that I could find of somebody who wants to centralize power so deeply and rejects the institutions on which a society is founded, and that's worked out okay. Usually, there's chapters in history books about folks who have tried to do that sort of thing. I also wanted to kind of touch on your comment earlier about how people are saying don't be alarmist about this. One of the things that I've heard talked about a lot is, the reality is, as a society, we've just gone through 3 years almost of unmitigated shit show because of COVID and all of the things that have come with that. And there are historical examples of when a society goes through a time of crisis, you get these people that pop up that claim to have all the solutions, and they're the ones that you can, trust to solve the problems, and they centralize the power. It doesn't seem like it again, like there's no examples of that working out particularly well. Is that something that you're at all concerned about? Do you think that there's part of the conversation that needs to be, hey, maybe we don't wait till the whole house is burnt down. Maybe when we smell smoke, we go, maybe we have a problem here.
Yeah. And so like 2 points. The one, just for a second, going back to what you're saying earlier, because of course, what always happens in this conversation is people say, but Quebec. So I just want to make it very clear that you're exactly right, that there is no precedent for this, for something like the Free Alberta strategy. The Quebec government has, for sure, for instance, had made symbolic votes about, for instance, that, the COVID emergency or whatever, but that wasn't a law. They didn't pass a law. They didn't say that they weren't going, it was essentially just like, it was just a bunch of what they call their members of parliament, sort of just like vote, essentially expressing their disapproval or something like that. When they do use the charter, there is this notwithstanding clause, right, in the charter, and people always sort of think that now it's just like this free for all. But actually, the notwithstanding clause in the charter is like this like very specific tool that applies to specific rights under the charter. It doesn't apply to federalism. It doesn't apply to banning federal laws. In fact, what it does is what it allows, and I note this with some irony because Quebec, of course, like, it's hard to really pin down the politics there, but it's kind of a conservative government, as is Ontario. So both Quebec and Ontario, when they use the notwithstanding clause, they use it to shield their own laws from charter scrutiny, right? So they're not tearing down or blocking federal law. They're saying basically, we know our law's charter is non-compliant with the charter, and we don't care. And it's like, too bad. And so they can do that, and that's a prerogative. And they're sort of like, their citizens can decide, punish them essentially at the polls. That's the idea that, that was, I think, the theory at the time, that that's how that would work. But anyway, so I just want to say that anytime anyone says that this is like, that there are precedents for the Free Alberta strategy in other parts of Canada, there are not. Those are just like totally not the case. Yeah, I mean, and on the second point, again, I absolutely, like, and of course the other thing, of course, too, is, and this was the issue with COVID too, is that people worry, if you take steps, if you do if someone does raise the alarm, or a group of people do, and mitigation measures are, some kind of mitigation is undertaken, let's say, then all of a sudden, like, the thing that was going to happen doesn't happen, and people say, see, you didn't need to panic, right? You didn't need to freak out. And it's like, well, no, but we did the thing, and that's why it didn't happen. So, I mean, yeah, look, I mean, like I said, I have this, like, I have, and there's obviously there's a bunch of people who are raising the alarm, I think, on this. And speaking for myself, I'll admit that I sometimes have moments of, like, being kind of self-conscious about it, and sort of being like, do I want to be that guy again right now? Maybe I can just leave it alone. Maybe I should just go for a bike ride or something. But it is a big deal. It is a big deal. And it seems like, again, if you look at history and you look at precedents and you look at the people who have thought about this, then they all seem to sort of say, no, you have to say stuff. You have to, you kind of have to, don't, one of the interesting things is, in Tim Snyder's book on tyranny, one of the first lesson is don't obey in advance, basically, right? Like, don't kind of like give away the game, and so, so anyways, reading all that kind of stuff, thinking about that kind of stuff, some of it's very intuitive, I think. And then, but yeah, you have to, and it does seem awkward, and it does seem weird, and maybe some people, again, people will sort of say, oh, you're panicking or whatever, and it's like, I say, well, no, I'm not panicking, actually. Like, you should see me panicking. I can, I panic when I've got 3 kids, for instance, to deal with, but this is me saying, no, like, but pay attention, right? Pay attention.
Now, I got 2 other big questions that I promised myself I would ask, and you teed me up on one of them, so I'm just going to jump right into it. Given that this is potentially, he said cautiously, a law, I mean, assuming that the lieutenant governor doesn't go, hell no, this could potentially become a law on Alberta's books. And is there a risk or a possibility of the provincial government, Danielle Smith's group of folks, saying, it's a law, so now we're going to notwithstanding clause this too, suckers?
No, because it doesn't, like, again, the notwithstanding clause can be used to essentially shield laws from, I think, sections 2 and 7 through to 15 of the charter. So freedom of expression, and then 7 through 15 are essentially like equality rights and rights of due process. When whoever it is who walks into court, and I'll say that right now, like, if this law becomes like makes its way through the legislature and is passed that day, there will be people in court to have it struck down. And I think there's like zero question that it'll be struck down. There's like, it's not even, there's no like, there's not even like it just doesn't even pass the red face test. Like, there's nothing you could do to convince a court. Like, and again, I'll say, obviously we don't have the draft text or whatever, but just like the basic, as it's been explained, that the legislature would sit there and declare which laws from Ottawa it's not, that it deems to sort of like violate its rights. So like, first of all, there is no power, there's no lawmaking power like that in the Constitution. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that a province can pass laws to pass judgment on the other level of government's laws. But second, and more fundamentally for me always, is that's not their job. The legislature doesn't get to pass judgment on laws. That's what the courts do. And so I think, that same day. I mean, and there are ways. This then becomes like falls into sort of like legal strategy and the kinds of like relief that you can seek. But suffice it to say, like I think again, yeah, the day that this law, if this law ever passed, that same day it's going to be challenged, and that same day I think parties would look to have it declared like unlawful that same day, or at the very least to prohibit the government from taking any steps towards implementing it until such a time, until the courts, and that's because our courts take some time sometimes. And so, sure, fair game. But there's a process for that. There's a test. And again, there's no question in my mind that anyone challenging this law would be successful. So for sure, and I wondered, it's like fair point. Like, let's go on things. It's like, so then what? Right? Like you got everyone hopped up on this notion of this law. You said that it was going to be a big part of your fight back strategy, and it's going to get torpedoed the day that you pass it. And so then that's when, Rob Anderson says, for instance, so what? We'll just ignore the courts. The courts will say it's unconstitutional. We'll ignore them. Right. And that's the world then suddenly and then we're into the shit, right? At that point. I mean, once that happens, like, why would anyone then, like there's, well, maybe you and I, and maybe the majority of people tend to be sort of like law abiding, right? But like, holy smokes, what a precedent. Well, the premier doesn't have to listen to the law. Okay, sounds good.
The thought experiment that I want to, and I realize it's probably a reach, but looking at the authors of the Free Alberta strategy, without commenting on them at all, because I don't want to go anywhere near that. But like we're talking about some folks who have some background in the things. What's the counter argument for like, here's what I'm trying to make sense of. I'll use a metaphor. If I was to go to a car buying place and the car dealer said, you know what, I know that you're looking for a car with round wheels, but let me tell you, we got some square wheels. They're going to change your world. There's a part of me that wants to go, okay, what does this guy know that I don't? Because that sounds so outrageous. There's no way that there's any kind of like, either you're just lying to me because I wore my sucker face to the car dealership, or there's something that you know that I don't. So in the most generous interpretation, how does this thing get to be a thing?
And yeah, I mean, so that's probably, a question, like the $1 million question. My own assessment on it, the only thing I can think is that they are so far, I don't want to say so far gone, but essentially like there is this like real antipathy, this real hatred, this real sort of like opposition to all kinds of things like globalization, right? And science, action on climate change, right? Like, so like there's a whole bunch of things that are happening in the world that don't jive with these authors, for as an example, and that's been the case for a number of years, decades, and I think they just, and again, we're speculating, but like the only thing I can think is just that they hate that stuff so much that actually, what you and I might consider like a bad trade-off, they don't see that way actually, because to them, the status quo, the current situation is so bad that they're prepared to like, figuratively burn it all down, because even if, yeah, as bad as that might be, it's better to them than continuing the status quo, right? Like, and you have to remember, like, one of these, one of the authors also wrote a report for the Allen Inquiry, right? Talking about essentially like the watermelon sort of activists, right? They're green on the outside, eco activists, and red socialists on the inside, right? And so like there's, and then the net, there were, so like there is this like, these folks, some of them for sure think that there really is this like conspiracy in the world that people want people to be energy poor, that people that people want people to not like this idea that you'll never own anything, you'll always have to rent, like all the WS stuff, like right, this all of this is part of this like rejection of the sort of the mainstream status quo. And I think so they are prepared to sell it, and this alternative, even if they know that it won't work, because in the subsequent chaos, they think even if there's a chance that they can roll something out different, something better, something that pushes back against that machine, that's what they want. And so then again, though, like I ask myself, and I think that there are diehards, I think, within those circles who think that way and who want those things. Do I think that a majority of Albertans agree with that? I don't think so. And that goes back to again, like actually a comment you made early on, and like I keep asking myself too, like why I'm an environmental law guy. Why am I talking about this? But so much of it is driven by these environmental issues in particular, right? Things like climate change, and even maybe taking a step back and just really the notion of science and evidence and how that informs our policy and our political choices and our political debates. So I do think it is essentially just like it's a rejection of the dominant worldview or anyways our worldview, and being prepared to sort of like roll the dice with something for something else, even even if that doesn't pan out and it goes really sideways, well, it's not that bad, because again, really rejecting the status quo.
It's just remarkable to me because, like, again, it feels like they're trying to sell a vehicle with square tires. And I mean, the two things that immediately come to mind are the premier who couldn't even put gas in his car says that thing ain't gonna drive, and B, I am at a loss for how it would even get off the lot, which seems to be one of the criticisms that a lot of people are making. If you were to, for people who aren't hyper engaged in this, for people who don't have a background in law or who don't follow this on a daily basis, what's the biggest thing that you would like Albertans to know or to hear about the Free Alberta Strategy and the Alberta Sovereignty Act?
When you go about your day, you wake up in the morning, you make your coffee, or you go pick one up on the way to work, and you do that, and you don't think, and then you drop your kids off, or you pick them up, and you go about your day, you go to work, and then you come home, and sometimes it's good, and sometimes it's tedious, and sometimes it's hard, but you go to bed and you sort of say, okay, well, another day, and you move on, and maybe you look forward to some holidays or something, I don't know. All of that depends on these institutions and these institutional arrangements that we don't think about very often. But they are critical. And they are things like the courts. They are things like impartial, independent courts. Police forces that also act in a non-political and impartial way, and legislatures that understand that while they represent, for instance, they represent our democratic will for sure, but they are not unencumbered, they are not unconstrained, that there are checks and balances there that exist on them as well, right? And so what I would say to people is to sort of like stop and think about what, because I think, we do, I think most folks would, like, if you stop thinking about, oh yeah, like, yeah, the courts, like, they're the judges and there's the building, but like things just sort of happen. Courts say things have to be a certain way, and then they are. Like, to think of that as an example, or to think about how, examples, we have sort of classic examples in Canada, and maybe this is a little bit less common, but like there have been times when politicians overreached, and they got hammered for it, right? Like, and the famous one is this one that I always go back to, Maurice Duplessis in Quebec, and it's actually really relevant. Will you permit me to give this sort of like,
Yeah.
So this is, from in the 50s and 60s, Jehovah's Witnesses in Quebec are starting to sort of like, they're like stronger, or they're starting to become more popular. and they're pamphleting, and Duplessis is a Catholic, and he's like, I'm not having any of this. And so the crackdown is severe. They're being thrown in jail. And there's this restaurant owner, Frank Roncarelli, and he starts using his profit, like his profits from liquor sales in particular, to post bonds to like get Jehovah's Witnesses out of jail. So he was a Jehovah's Witness too. And the premier revokes his liquor license for that reason, that he doesn't like what he's doing. And this is like kind of like, this is canon in administrative law. This is one of like the main cases that we teach, where the Supreme Court said, of course you can't do that. Of course you can't just because you don't like something, you can't use this power to then take away this person's civil rights, right? And it's their ability to make a living and all that kind of stuff. Everything, all power is constrained by the rule of law, right? And so, you know, like we stop and think about what kind of province you are living in suddenly when the premier says that she's going to tell the police who to arrest and not to arrest, right? When she starts saying, yeah, I don't like that judgment, so I'm not going to listen to it. We're going to ignore that court. There's no way to hold that kind of person accountable. And you may think that they are your, you know, and that's to me, that's the definition of tyranny. When you have a person or a group that cannot be held accountable because they've essentially neutered, you know, like they've disabled the mechanisms of accountability, then like, is that really the kind of province we want to live in? Does anybody want to live in that kind of province? I certainly don't. And so that is, I think, you know, to come back to your question, I think I get it. People are frustrated. There's lots of, you know, there's a lot of things going on, you know, and I want to say this to those people who are in particularly, you know, like have a very strong view about Ottawa, for instance. I may not share that view. I look at things a little bit differently for sure. But I would really urge them to stop and think about what it is they're, you know, the gamble they're making, basically, because they may think that Miss Smith will be their tyrant for hire. But the thing with tyrants is that they're really only their own. And again, I refer to this in the sense that someone who refuses to be held accountable, that's really, to me, the definition of tyranny in that kind of like modern sort of like 20th century sense. Of course, some have gone on to do atrocious things, and that then tends to be the focus there. But for me, it really just comes down to this, is that, you know, and it's interesting for, you know, a political movement that tends to sort of like say that our leaders are actually there to serve us, right? This is the exact opposite of that. You will find yourself in a situation where the leader has clearly said that they serve themselves and their view of things. And once they've disabled those other mechanisms, like then we're at their whim, right? And I just think that's such a, you know, and of course that can happen anytime, but when someone's telling you that that's what they want, that's how they see things, I think that is, again, like I'll say, like, I think at that point you just say, no, that's going too far. That's and really, like, just from a self-interested perspective, right? That's just not the kind of person you want to have leading your province.
Anything else you'd like people to hear? Anything else you'd like people to know?
There was the one interesting point that you mentioned. You know, you talked about, you know, the historical examples, you know, and you referenced COVID, right, and the fact that we just finished these, you know. So in fact, actually, if you look at history and you read about it, then it's like, actually, that's in a sense what makes me, like, if I hesitate sometimes to talk about this, then it's like remembering that, because it means essentially that we are super primed. Like, when you think about when democracies failed in the 20th century, it was around these sort of like significant events, oftentimes when people were, you know, essentially like, out of balance, out of kilter, struggling, that things were in a bad way, lots of frustration. And then that one person comes in and says, I'll fix it. I can fix this. Trust me. And they start launching into sort of like simplistic solutions as well, right? And scapegoating other people. And then, you know, and essentially it's like a playbook from there. You know, and again, like it's amazing that we've been talking about all of this and we haven't talked about Donald Trump. But, you know, like, I mean, he's the paradigm example right now of this stuff, right? And and look where it ended. Like it did end with violence, right? And I guess ending is, maybe that's optimistic of me. I think that this is not yet over, but it's certainly right. It led
There's some
to
nuclear problems that apparently need to be worked out.
right. Yeah, you'll have to sort that out now. But and we saw again, like we saw that in Coots. I mean, there were people prepared with armed weapons, right? And so this is the other thing that's just really problematic about all of this, is that, like, there are, even if, I think the most generous interpretation here is that Smith is, Miss Smith and her crew, like they're just trying to send a message, right? They don't intend to go through with any of this stuff. It's just to send a message to Ottawa to back off. I think she sort of said something like that recently. Some of the people who are voting for her, they're not half in. They don't think this is just a symbol. They're expecting to see, right? They want results. They've been cranked up and torqued, and they expect to see this stuff, just like a whole bunch of MAGA folks did, right? In the US. And when they don't get that, things can go sideways, right? And so that's why, again, it's also, on top of everything else, it's also just like hugely irresponsible. And again, disqualifying in my view, because there are always going to be people, like you always have to be, I think, as a leader, if you're claiming that you want to be a leader, a politician, that you have to be mindful that there's always going to be groups that will take it, that, like people will receive your message a certain way, and some will receive it 120%, right? Like 150%. That's just the way it is. There's always going to be, maybe that's a small group, but they always exist. And you kind of have to calibrate your messages and your promises, I think, in keeping that in mind. And it seems like that sort of like just basic, like sort of guidepost, that's gone. And instead it's just like full tilt. And again, I think if things happen in a bad way, no one can say, well, we didn't see that coming. Like, I mean, of course you did. We've been watching it for the past 3 years.
I got one more question, just because it percolated up in my head, and I'm notorious for saying one more question, so I'm going to ask you one more question. But I also think it might highlight the importance of the role that the court plays when it comes to mitigating some of the decisions that politicians make in the legislature. It came out this week, for anybody who's playing the home game. We're recording this in the evening of August 13th. It came out earlier this week that Doug Schweitzer has announced that he's going to be leaving as an MLA sometime. We don't know when. And there was a bunch of debate that happened in regards to, so is there going to be a by-election then? Because the general rule from the laws and stuff is that in the last year of the life of the legislature, you don't have to have a by-election. And the debate that's been going on has been, well, they've created these mandatory election dates, fixed election dates. Every 4 years, it's going to be this in May. That's what's happening. It's done. Deal. Every 4 years. And so there were some people who argued, well, that means the life of the legislature is 4 years. There's other laws that say, that existed prior to this change of the 4-year election cycle, that say, well, actually it's 5 years. And there was a lot of debate that happened as to, okay, what's it going to be? And what I found particularly fascinating was the response from most of the legal scholars or the lawyers. I mean, there were a lot of us who were just like pundits and shit, and we were like, no, that's my thing. But the response from most legal scholars and lawyers was, well, that's for the courts to sort out. And so it kind of highlights to me the fact that, parliamentarians are fallible, and they will overlook these things, and then you end up in a situation like we have with Mr. Schweitzer, and everybody's going, oh, what's next? And if we don't have the courts to sort that out, we got some very real problems. But I'm curious, what's your take?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll give you the lawyer's answer. I mean, I'd want to see the law, right? Like I need to see and I think like if there are like lawyers, commentators who are going there, then what I'm going to suggest is that there probably are maybe two different laws on the books, and sometimes that happens where you have to sort of then look at them and sort of say, okay, which one takes precedence here, right? Or how do they work together? But I think the point that I think I think you're absolutely right to be like, oh yeah, like we're politicians are fallible, and of course judges are humans too, but they have their own system of accountability, right? And they're deliberately very different, right? So in the legislature, we expect our MLAs to represent our sort of democratic sort of will, and when they don't, we vote them out every 4 years, right? We don't vote for our judges. They're appointed and they're independent, but that's not to say that they are without accountability. Their accountabilities exist in the system of appeals, right? So we have the Court of Queen's Bench, and then we have the Court of Appeal, and then some cases, not all, but some portion of cases will be appealed to the Supreme Court, right? And it's really like one of the things that kind of drives me bonkers is that you get these sort of like broadside attacks against the Supreme Court. But the reality is that in Canada, at least, we've managed actually to not politicize our judiciary the same way that they have in the States, right? So you can't actually, in any given instance, really like finger one judge or the other based on who appointed them, which way things are going to turn out, and I think what I would remind, again, those who are sympathetic to Ms. Smith and her views. I mean, our Chief Justice right now was appointed by Stephen Harper, right? But he's the Chief Justice who, for instance, wrote the Greenhouse Gas Pricing Act, Pollution Pricing Act reference that decided that actually it was constitutional, right? Notwithstanding what the Alberta Court of Appeal said. We have like these systems are not perfect. They are not perfect. And in fact, for instance, like the Court of Appeal here in Alberta has weighed in on a few things that I've disagreed very strongly with their opinions on some matters, right? But then there's a system for that. I can write scholarly articles. I can maybe intervene or whatever. If anybody doesn't like something, they're free to engage that space too. And that's not to say that it's easy. I'm not pretending that it's easy, but there is a system, and it's built the way it is for a reason. And tearing it down doesn't work. It doesn't. The thing that comes after isn't going to be better. And there's just a certain fundamental logic to it that is just like, again, it keeps me safe and free, but it also keeps those people like it keep people that, again, and I don't want, like, I don't mean that in any kind of wrong way, like, but this system, for everybody who's frustrated about Ottawa, you have actually levers and tools that you can use, and of course, and political sort of freedom. Imagine what would happen, how you would react if it was Justin Trudeau saying he's going to ignore the courts, which, for all his faults and all his problems, like he has never said. Imagine, and in fact, the one time, right, of course, one of the main scandals against the Trudeau government was that they had tried to interfere in the prosecution of SNC-Lavalin. Well, Danielle Smith is saying straight up, she would tell the cops that even though people were, like in the case there of those ministers, that they were breaking the law, that she would tell the police to stand down. It doesn't work that way. It can't work that way. You can't have a premier or a prime minister who tells law enforcement who to essentially charge and not charge. The same way Casey Madhu, when he gets a speeding ticket or a ticket for being on his phone, can't call the police up, the chief of police, and complain about his ticket, right? Because we don't want politicians to be making those calls on a whim. Part of what protects us is that there's a professional police force that makes those decisions, and they're accountable too, right? They're accountable in their own way. So like all of this stuff, there's a reason for it. And it's cumbersome sometimes, and it gets in the way of people who want to have that kind of like monolithic power, but that's on purpose because we don't want people to have that monolithic power.
I can't think of a better note to end it on because I agree with you 100%. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat. and to clarify some of these things, because I think that one of the things that we're missing is we have a lot of politicians who are willing to say whatever it takes that they feel will get them closer to more power. And if we don't stop and listen to people who actually know the things, we're going down a very dangerous road. So thank you so much for taking the time to chat tonight.
You're welcome. Like I said, it's hard. I'll have to, like, I thought a lot about this ahead of time in my own brain, how to convey these things. So anyways, hopefully it's a conversation that we keep having, all of us in Alberta, and hopefully we don't have, if in 3 months from now they're saying, yeah, see, you were stressing for nothing, I won't complain. I'll be okay with that.
I'll say yay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
I'll do a little happy dance.
We'll join here for beers. Yeah,
I'll get some sparklers. It'll be great. As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here at The Breakdown, we would love it if you swung by our Patreon page at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab and signed up for a small monthly sponsorship of the work that we're trying to do here. It is because of the support that we receive from our Patreon sponsors that we're able to continually up our game, and it is tremendously appreciated. So I want to throw a big thank you out to them, and you can go ahead and visit that website and join and support us as well, because we need all the help we can get. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much for listening and being part of these important conversations. And we will see you next time on The Breakdown.